Okay, guys, I'm going to go over the homework from last night. Let's get this little camera somewhere around here where we're not too much in the middle of the way. Here we go. So we had a loanable funds market model activity, and we were supposed to work our way through 1 through 5. So we're going to start off with number 1. Use the graph below. So looking at that graph, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to see that my QE is less than my QY. So my current equilibrium, the output that my economy is producing, is less than my full potential output. So I'm in a recessionary gap. So I know that right off the bat with this graph right here. So let's work our way through. So number 1, I'm just going to, for my own note, I'm just going to say recessionary gap, so that way I can see it. What type of discretionary fiscal policy should be pursued? Well, if we're in a recession, what are we going to want to do? We're going to want to get out of that. We need to expand our output. So we want an expansionary fiscal policy. So expansionary, yep, spelled that wrong, fiscal policy. What does that mean? We want to move our aggregate demand to the right. We want to expand it. We want our QE, our short run equilibrium, our current GDP to get bigger. We want it to equal our full potential output. So that's where we want to go. All right, B. What should the government do to government spending and taxes? If I want to grow the economy, what's my option with government spending? Well, I want to increase government spending. If I increase government spending, that's going to provide more money in the economy. We are growing the G component of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand would shift to the right. The other thing we could do is we could cut taxes. What are we doing there? We're stimulating consumer spending because by cutting taxes, we have more disposable income. People are going to go out there, they're going to spend money, and that moves the C component of our aggregate demand. As a result of the fiscal policy, would the budget be balanced, in a surplus, or in a deficit? So anytime we run an expansionary fiscal policy, we're going to run a budget deficit. Why? Because the nature of these two things right here. If government spending goes up and taxes remain constant, then we're spending more than we're bringing in. Our spending is greater than our revenue. If we cut taxes but leave government spending constant, then we're still spending more than we got in revenue. So say, for example, government spending was $500 billion a year. So this is what we're spending. And what are we bringing in taxes? If we're also bringing in 500, right now we're balanced. Those two are equal. If we increase government spending to 600 and we keep taxes constant at 500, well, then we're running a deficit of $100 billion. And so that's a deficit. If we kept our spending constant at 500, but we cut taxes to 400, we're still going to be running a deficit of $100 billion. Okay. Part D. How does the government get the additional funds for this policy? Well, they're going to have to go and borrow it from the private sector. They're going to have to borrow that money from the private sector. And so draw a loanable funds market at equilibrium labeled RE and QE. Sounds good? So I got my real interest rates right here, my quantity of loanable funds. I just write quantity of loanable funds. You don't have to put the QLF on there. I just do. That way I remember it's the loanable funds market. And then we have the demand for loanable funds, and we have the supply of loanable funds. And the demand is going to increase in this situation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's label that boy out. Beep. So RE at our equilibrium, beep, 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 and QE. So that is where my loanable funds market starts. We're not talking about supply of loanable funds in this unit because that's something we're going to do when we get to Unit 4 on people saving money. What we're talking about here is those people that demand money. Consumers are going to demand loanable funds. Businesses are going to demand loanable funds, government is going to demand loanable funds, and foreigners are going to demand loanable funds. So again, it looks a lot like that aggregate demand, or what makes up our GDP. So if the government wants more loanable funds, they're going to have to borrow. So that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. This initial spot was consumers borrowing, businesses borrowing, government borrowing, and foreigners borrowing money from us. But when the government decided to deficit spend, we had to get more money for the government. So they increased the demand for loanable funds. So maybe they borrowed that $100 billion that we're looking at right up here when we ran our increased government spending or cutting taxes. They had to borrow $100 billion, which means there was a growth in the quantity of loanable funds and real interest rates went up. So that addressed number two. What happened to the real interest rates and the quantity of loanable funds? Well, I was above and let's see, our interest rates went up and our quantity of loanable funds went up. Boom. All right, so there's number one. Push this bad boy. Let's take a look at number two. Scrolling it, scrolling it, scrolling. There you go. Use the graph below. All righty. So here, what are we looking at? We are looking at a situation where our QE is greater than our QY. The output that we're producing in our economy is greater than our full potential output. So we know with this one, we are in an inflationary gap. Inflationary gap. Throw a little box on that. Just I like to tuck that in there for memory's sake. What should the government do to government spending and taxes? Oh, whoa, I got ahead of myself there. A was what type of discretionary fiscal policy should be pursued? We want QE to get smaller. We want to contract it. We want QE to be equal to QY. So we want to run a contractionary fiscal policy. Oh, my thing stopped focusing. Hey, little fella, focus, follow me, come right there. There it is. Get it. Come on. Nope. Put that away. Put that back. Focus. Come on. There you go. You see it. Find it. There it is. Don't mess with it. Contractionary fiscal policy. So B was what should the government do to government spending and taxes? Contractionary fiscal policy is going to be the opposite of our expansionary fiscal policy. So here we want to decrease government spending or increase taxes. Why? Why would we want to do this? Come on. Why would we want to do this? Because by cutting government spending, it's going to move aggregate demand to the left. By increasing taxes, that cuts into people's disposable income and they won't spend as much. So we're messing with the G component of aggregate demand and we're messing with the C component of aggregate demand once again. All right, part C. As a result of the fiscal policy, would the budget be balanced in a surplus or in a deficit? This time, we're going to be running a surplus because we're cutting spending and increasing taxes. Our spending is now going to be greater than our revenue. Our spending will be less than our revenue, no matter which situation we go with, whether we cut spending or increase taxes. Part D. Let's see, would the government need to borrow as much money as a result of this fiscal policy? No, the government would not need to borrow as much money. If they were usually borrowing money for everyday business, they wouldn't need to borrow as much because they've cut spending. So in this case, and we're never going to see a problem like this on the AP exam, I just thought it'd be fun to work it out in reverse. They want us to draw a loanable funds market at equilibrium with RE and QE noted. So let's do that. So we're starting off our loanable funds market with our real interest rate, our quantity of loanable funds, our supply, our demand, our quantity E, and our real interest rate E. Boom. So there is our initial graph. What happened? Let's see, indicate the effect of the fiscal policy on the loanable funds market. So we still have consumers borrowing, businesses are borrowing, governments borrowing, and foreigners are borrowing from us. But this time, government is not going to need to borrow as much loanable funds, so our demand would just simply fall to the left. And we'd have a R1 and a Q1. This is indicated above. And in this one, I would say that my real interest rates went down, and my quantity of loanable funds that were borrowed, they also went down. Boom. Alrighty. Hopefully changing papers won't give me that same issue again, but we'll find out. Number 3, assume the economy is in a short-run equilibrium at its long-run potential. Cool, that's always an easy one. If our economy, our short-run equilibrium, so this is number 3, our short-run equilibrium is always my QE. And our short-run equilibrium is at our long-run potential. There went my screen again. It's at our potential. So our potential is QY. Hey fella, find it. Now come down, relax. Come on, little fella. Come on. There it is. So now I know that my QE is equal to my QY. So let's draw that bad boy out. My ASAD model has my price level and my real GDP. I've got an AD, I have an AS, I have my price level at equilibrium, and then I would have my quantity at equilibrium. But since they said that my QE is equal to my QY, since I am at a short run equilibrium at full potential, I'm going to sit on my long run aggregate supply. So this would be QY. Cool. All right, if the government increases spending to rebuild communities affected by hurricanes without raising taxes, all right, would the national budget be balanced, in a deficit, or in a surplus? Okay, so with B, if the government spends money without raising taxes, we're going to be running a deficit. They increased spending, did not increase taxes. So that's B. All right. How does the government get the additional loanable funds needed for this project? Private sector. They have to go and borrow money from the loanable funds market. So private sector. We can also call that our loanable funds market. Boom. Draw a loanable funds market labeled RE and QE and show the effect of the increased government spending on the real interest rates and the quantity of loanable funds. Label the new curve D2, R1, and Q1. Sounds good. So this is C. My initial loanable funds would have our real interest rates, my quantity of loanable funds, supply and demand of loanable funds, my QE, my RE. Now the government had to borrow money, so government is going to borrow money. This is the demand for all loanable funds by consumers, by businesses, by government, and by foreigners. Government has to borrow more money, so that's increasing the demand for loanable funds. We had some weird labeling this time. Labeling was D2, R1, and Q. That doesn't make any sense. Let's just fix that for the future right now as this is happening live. Sweet. So we'll call that D1, Q1, R1. Awesome. And that brings us to the next section, number D. What effect would the change in real interest rate determined above have on investment spending and consumer spending? Ooh, all right. So in this case, if our real interest rates went up, so real interest rates went up, and consumers and businesses, they want to borrow money, right? This guy, he wants to buy a new house, he needs to take out a loan. Well, if interest rates have gone up, is he going to want to take out that loan? Probably not. He's going to want to sit it out and wait for interest rates to drop. If businesses were looking to buy more capital stock, more expensive goods that are going to require a loan, and interest rates have gone up, Are they going to want to do that when interest rates are higher? Probably not. So in both situations, consumer spending on large goods that are going to require a loan are going to fall, and businesses are not going to buy goods that are going to require a loan. So what is that going to do to aggregate demand? Well, if C falls and I falls, that means aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. So even though initially we did something like that, aggregate demand grew a little bit in the short term because they went out and spent money to help out hurricanes. By raising the interest rates, aggregate demand is actually going to fall back down a little bit because consumer spending and investment spending is going to fall as well. Cool. All right, let's do number 4. Here comes another problem with my screen or my camera. Number 4, and it's blurry. Let's figure out this phenomenon once and for all. We went close. We saw it. You learned your friend's name. You went down there. Come on, little fella. Come on now. I'm going to start writing. Yes, there it is. Assume the economy has a short-run equilibrium of 900 and a full output of 1,000. Awesome. All right. They want us to draw it. So short run, my QE is equal to 900 schmackers. And my full employment, my QY, is 1,000 with the full number of zeros. So draw that bad boy out for part A. Price level, GDP, AD, AS, my QE, my short run equilibrium, my current output is at 900, but my economy should be producing at 1,000. So where did I draw myself? I drew myself a recessionary gap. So with the recessionary gap, I'm going to run into a situation. And it says, A, what type of gap? This is a recessionary gap. And what is the gap in real GDP? So there's a tiny a and a tiny b. The gap is this little number right here. That gap is 100 Kirschmackers. So the gap was $100. We are producing $100 less in GDP than we should. Draw a loanable funds market, labeling our, wrong. Draw a loanable funds market at equilibrium. Same thing. All right, here we go. Loanable funds, R, and quantity of loanable funds, demand, supply, quantity at equilibrium, RE. There is my, so I'm right here. I gotta mark myself that way I don't get confused. Assume an expansionary fiscal policy resulted in an increase of GDP of $100. Yes, they solved the problem. Go team. All right, so indicate the change on the ASAD model. So if I did an expansionary fiscal policy, I'm always moving AD. So AD goes to the right, boom. And they said it was of $100. So my QE is now 1,000. So my QE, my short run equilibrium, is now my full potential output. I've returned home. Go home, ball. That should have been labeled PLE. I'm sorry about that. And my price level 1 has now gone up. Okay. So indicate the change on the loanable funds market. Well, if it was an expansionary fiscal policy, we know every time it's an expansionary fiscal policy, the demand for loanable funds has to increase. Why? Because government's borrowing money. So D is going to increase. That leads us to a quantity 1 and a real interest rate 1. And boom, we have gone up and up. Now, this is where it's going to get tricky. Assume the change in real interest rates found above results in a decrease in investment spending and consumer spending by $20. Whoa, bummer. Okay, so what happened? Remember, when we have this effect, when we have a fiscal policy, an expansionary fiscal policy, we increase the demand for loanable funds, real interest rates go up. That means consumers aren't going to take out those loans. Businesses are not going to take out those loans, and aggregate demand falls to the left a little bit. This time they're saying that that increase in interest rate curbed our consumer spending and our investment spending by 20 bucks. So we have to indicate that change and label our new spot on our ASAD graph. So let's see. Indicate the change on ASAD model, labeling the new value of GDP and the price level of PL1. Sounds good. Should have been PL2 because this is a work in progress. So here we go. That would be, if we took 1,000 and we minus 20 bucks, that's 980. So I would make that somewhere like right there. And since I'm running out of space, I'll put it right there, 980. And that would be a PL2. So this was 81, and this is 82. So we started here. We're in a recession. Government fixed it, but they raised the interest rates because of the increase in demand for loanable funds. That curbed consumer spending. It curbed investment spending. It decreased aggregate demand by 20 bucks, and we resulted back in a recessionary gap of $20. What is this phenomenon called? This is called the crowding out effect. And one of the most prominent things we're going to see on any AP exam, they love asking about the crowding out effect. All right, that was number 4. We got one more to go. I'm going to try and stay on this page this time. That way we don't run into the same non-focusing issues. I'll just write smaller. So assume an economy has a short-run equilibrium of $100 and a full employment output of 75. Ooh, okay, so my QE is 100. My full employment output is 75. So in this case, we realize that my QE is greater than my QY. If I'm supposed to draw that bad boy out, I get my ASAD model right here. This is number A, price level, GDP, AS, AD. This is my price level at equilibrium. My QE, my current output, my short-run equilibrium is 100. My full employment output, what my economy should be producing, is 75. So that's where my long-run aggregate supply sits. And what do we just draw ourselves out? Boom, an inflationary gap. So A, what type? That is an inflationary gap. And B, what is the gap in real GDP? So what's my gap? 100 minus 75, 25 Kirschmackers. Now they want us to draw a loanable funds market. Alrighty. So I'm going to draw that loanable fund. I'll say real interest rate, quantity of loanable funds, supply of loanable funds, demand of loanable funds, interest rate at equilibrium, quantity at equilibrium, and let's see, we're good. So now we're on C. Assume a contractionary fiscal policy resulted in a decrease in GDP of $25. Well, that's going to correct. That's going to correct this gap right here. So contractionary fiscal policy means that they've cut government spending or increased taxes. So aggregate demand is going to shift to the left by 25. So it's correcting this spot. So I have a new price level, and we've returned back to our long-run aggregate supply. All right, so that's our change there, AD to 81. And they want us to show the change in the loanable funds market. Since the government did a contractionary fiscal policy, that means they're going to run a budget surplus, right? If we're running a budget surplus, they're not going to need to borrow as much money from the loanable funds. So the decrease in government borrowing leads to a decrease in demand for loanable funds. Real interest rate falls, quantity equilibrium drops. Boom, there's our change in our loanable funds market. Assume that the change in real interest rates found above results in an increase in investment spending and consumer spending. Okay, well, interest rates fell. Mr. Owen's like, oh, snap, I'm going to go treat myself and I'm going to go get something or take out a loan. I'm going to take out a loan to buy something expensive, or businesses are going to take out a loan for more capital goods. So that grew aggregate demand, right? Because I'm a consumer, C went up, aggregate demand went to the right. Or I went up, aggregate demand goes to the right. So in that case, in either one, that would move aggregate demand to the right a little bit. They said it was only $5. So AD goes, little guy right there, and that would be 80. So now we're in an inflationary gap by $5. There we go. That was the work. I will take some photos of these and put them on the Google Classroom. And I'll also post some other videos that relate to this stuff because this one gets a little sketchy. And I will talk to you soon. Have a great day.